And welcome today to this seminar. I'm going to introduce Nando Lewis. Nando is a PhD student at King's College London, and I'll let him introduce his topic. And just today, this event is being recorded, so if you speak, please use the mic. Okay, thank you.
Okay, thank you, everyone. Can you hear me clearly? So I've just finished part of my PhD research in Kenya, up in Kakuma, interviewing South Sudanese refugees on the reasons why they are fleeing South Sudan and why choose Kenya when there are other options available. So it's all very fresh in my mind. I finished the last interviews on Monday, so I'm still drawing everything together. And my one request of you all is to be as critical as possible. I had a focus group at the end of my interviews with 4 interviewees who were particularly sharp, and they, as many South Sudanese are, were very nice and kind and did not want to tell me where I'd made any mistakes. So I specifically asked them to criticize me, and then things got very interesting. So to help me learn and to make sure that the research is accurate and useful, please, if you see something that you disagree with, pop up a hand at the end or in the middle and tell me. So I heard a lot of very disturbing things during the interviews, and this is from people who want this information made public. They want people to know what's happening. Of course, I never wrote down anyone's name, and I would never say the names. I don't remember them for most people I spoke to. It would rather be I spoke to a woman in Kakuma who said this, but a lot of the quotes are distressing. If at any point you think they're too distressing for you, just pop a hand up like this discreetly. I'll notice it, and I won't read out the full quotes, and we'll leave it there. So my aim in the PhD research was to understand all of the different reasons why people are leaving South Sudan. Of course, violent conflict is undoubtedly the major reason, but some people left an area in 2016, others left in 2018. Why is it that people don't leave at the same time? What is it about the different types of violence? For example, in South Sudan, you've got government fighting the rebels. Then even before South Sudan was created, you had South Sudan fighting the North. Then in 2012, there were lots of border clashes in the oil-rich areas between South Sudanese forces and North Sudanese forces. There's community violence and community clashes which have escalated because there's no rule of law, and there are massive attacks on civilians by government and rebel forces. And then there's general banditry, because so many people have weapons. So what I tried to do firstly was delve into, what type of violence causes people to flee most? How do they have different effects on people's decisions to leave? And then, of course, there are also other factors, such as a lack of basic services like healthcare, education, food, that also have a major impact on people wanting to leave. And so these are the things I was trying to understand better throughout the course of the interviews, and they are currently not very well understood in general for refugee situations, I think, from the literature that I've read at least, and particularly for South Sudan. And it's a reason I chose South Sudan, because not much has been written. Say the UNHCR reports largely quote violence and often food insecurity as a major cause for refugees leaving, but there's not very much going beyond that. And I think a clear example of that is in 2017, UNHCR Uganda prepared their predictions for the total number of South Sudanese refugees that would arrive in the whole year, and by the end of March they'd already surpassed that number. And so they revised it in May, and then I think by the end of August they'd already surpassed the revised figure. And when you're already facing a 70% funding shortfall, that's a major problem, suddenly having essentially I think 2 or 3 times more people than you expected. So I'm hoping that by creating a better understanding of why people are leaving and why they choose their destination or why they end up in their destinations, we can start to predict the number of people that will be moving. So for example, if we can say next month there's likely to be 10,000 new South Sudanese arriving at the Kenyan border, then the UNHCR can think a month in advance, okay, we need enough food for 10,000 new people, rather than just taking the rations from the people already in Kakuma who don't have enough rations as it is. That's the very ambitious part of the project, and we'll see if it works. And so that will be using UN data, lots of statistical analysis, after I've created a theoretical model of why do people leave, what makes people stay, and why choose Kenya or why choose Uganda. I'll be going to Uganda next month, or this weekend even, for a few weeks to do research there. So, which one do I press? Oh, it's worked, lovely. The first obstacle we've got to overcome are economists who like decision theory, and unfortunately, because they're economists, use horrible English. Effectively, there are sort of, with refugee decisions to leave, they are often treated as decisions, even though I'm sure lots of people will argue that point, that when it's a choice between staying where you are and dying or leaving, it's not really a decision. But sort of my understanding of it is the only examples of forced displacement I can think of are slavery and deportations. So there is still a certain amount of agency, even if it's a very constrained choice. So the choice between staying and dying or leaving is an example of that, that it's a very simple choice to make. You don't have many options at all. So economists have come up with two ways of explaining this. The first is the relative utility model. That essentially means that if stuff that's happening in your home area is worse than what you'll have in your area of assistance, then you'll leave. And so it assumes that you have good information on where you're going and also good information on the threats you're facing there. So an example would be South Sudanese who are not having an education in South Sudan. They know that in Kenya you'll receive some education, and so they weigh up the options and decide, okay, Kenya will be better because I'll have a future. And the second type is the threshold model, and so that doesn't assume anything about your knowledge of where you're going. It just knows that as soon as things get bad enough, you leave. It doesn't matter where you're going to go, you just know that it's so bad you cannot stay anymore. And an example of that would be if your village is attacked, you've pretty much got no choice other than to run. And so then that's the threshold model. And these, I think, both are true in different instances for different people. And they're about as far as we've gotten with these theories, and we'll talk about them a bit later again. So there's been a fair amount of previous research investigating refugee decision-making, why you leave, where you end up. And there's essentially, from my reading of it, I've grouped it into 6 major factors. The first one, and the biggest one, is violent conflict and factors associated with violence. From what I've read, people haven't been so good at disaggregating violence and working out, well, what types of violence have what sort of effects. But generally it's a civil war, civilian targets, or general insecurity are the 3 main ones that are spoken about. The next set that are very often covered are political factors. So that's when specific ethnic groups are targeted by laws, by government, by police, and so are more likely to flee the country. It could be a lack of political or press freedom, and so if you identify with a particular political party, then you're more likely to leave. And then economic factors, so property loss, once you've got nothing left, it's a lot easier if we look at the threshold model to think, well, where I'm going will definitely be better. It's unclear what in what way economic factors work. For example, Colombia's had a long conflict and there's been lots and lots of internal displacement. Some research has found that wealthier people are more likely to stay because they can protect themselves better, they have walls. But then in other areas of the country, wealthy people are more likely to leave because they're a target for attacks and robberies. And so it seems that depending on the situation, the effects of economic, so wealth in particular, have very different factors. Similarly, a lack of jobs can contribute to people moving or even people joining the violence because it's one of the only options for employment. And that was the case for a few people I spoke to. Their choice was between joining up or leaving, and they had no other options available to them. Now, the bottom three relate more to where you decide to go. So for the social factors, there's been a lot of research on transborder ethnic kin networks. So if you have an ethnic group that speaks the same language as you across a border, you're more likely to want to go there because you think you'll be accepted, you won't be attacked by the local population, you can speak the language, perhaps you've been there before, perhaps you've got family who are there. And then also there are social factors like if your whole community leaves or your village or church leader says, okay, now it's time to leave, then everyone will go together. In terms of geographic factors, they generally influence whether you can stay. So if there's a very forested area or a mountainous area, it's easier to avoid armed forces and survive living in that area. But then it also makes it harder if the closest border between you and the closest border is a load of mountains. You're not going to be able to travel there so easily, so you may travel somewhere else that's further but is easier to navigate. And finally, environmental factors, particularly food insecurity. Pretty much every paper I've read says that food insecurity is important in refugee decision-making, but I think only one has explicitly investigated whether it was a factor in people leaving. And so I was particularly interested in that with this research, given that the UNHCR in their reports always cite food insecurity as well as a reason for people fleeing. And then also for generating my predictive models later, I can use lack of rainfall during key crop growing seasons to try and simulate food insecurity. So,
sorry, can I just ask one question?
Yes.
These models don't seem to nail down the external factor in terms of people being attracted by benefits, perceived job market, etc.
Yes, exactly. And I think that is a problem with a lot of the models that I've seen, that they look too much on the push factors rather than the pull factors. So what draws you to where you're going? And that's part of the reason why I'm looking at Kenya and Uganda to try and understand, well, why are some people from the same area going to Kenya whereas others go to Uganda? What drives these decisions? And if you know of any research that has looked at pull factors, it would be great to see it. Okay.
I don't, but certainly in the North American and in the European context, that's presented as
Yeah.
factor.
So that's for the long level coming to Europe, to America. People researching that are definitely more interested in it, but within an East African context. And so I'm specifically interested in why people are coming to Kenya or Uganda or Ethiopia, Khartoum. It's not been looked at so much. So Kakuma is, I think, if anyone looked at it, not the place you would establish a city of 150,000 odd people. Anywhere where camels thrive is unlikely to be able to support that many people in such a small area, especially if they're not able to work, are solely reliant pretty much on the assistance that they're given. You can see the land now pretty much just at the end of the rainy season. It's already very dry, and I've been told it gets a lot drier, and there's either just complete flooding or no water at all, which is not helpful. So Kakuma, I don't know if you know much about it. It was established, I think, in 1992, was it? And it is now made up of 4 different camps. And so a typical address in Kakuma may be Kakuma Camp 2. What's the next one? Village? No, it's neighborhood. Because you've got the blocks, and then there's 3 levels. Kakuma Camp 2, Zone 3, Block 14 might be an address. And within one of these blocks, you can have anywhere between, I think, 30 and 50 or 60 families living. So it's very big, very dense. And then recently created is Kalobeye, which is just a few kilometers away from Kakuma, and that's made up of 3 villages and is now home to 37,000 people, I think. So it's a lot of people in a very small area. So my methodology for this part of the PhD was to conduct semi-structured interviews with refugees about the reasons why they left, why they chose Kenya, and any other things they wanted to speak to me about. The general questions I wanted to ask, and then as things popped up, we broadened out the discussions. So this is a map of the different ethnic groups across South Sudan, and I aimed to interview around 50 to 60 people while I was there, taking around 20 from Dinka, 20 from Nuer, and then 20 from the other tribes, particularly down here in the equatorial or equatorian regions that are bordering DRC and Uganda, because for me it was very interesting. If you've left those regions very close to Uganda and you've ended up in Kenya, well, you must have some reason for having come that extra distance. And so that would hopefully give me more information about the decisions that people are making. So this is a map of where people came from that I spoke to. The black lines are Dinka, the blue lines are Nuer, and the red lines are Equatorian tribes, or in Western Bahr el Ghazal was a Luo, and then some Mabam up in Upper Nile. I interviewed 35 Dinka, 23 Nuer, and 25 Equatorians, and then 4 other tribes from the north. The reason there were so many more Dinka was there were literally queues of people waiting to speak to me, and it would have been rude to turn people away, and it was also, we had the time, and it was interesting to hear people. Whereas my translator, who I was working with for the Nuer and the Juba Arabic, he was physically disabled, but mentally very sharp, so it meant we couldn't work such long hours. And so we got slightly less in each group, but still well above my target. And I think it's a fair spread of South Sudan as a country. I wasn't able to find anyone from Western Equatoria, which was a shame, but from Central Equatoria and Eastern Equatoria, I managed to speak to Kakwa, Kuku, Madi, Acholi, Fajalu, and Lutoko, I think. I think there were 7 or 8. Lutuko, yes. And so for me, that was very good to get a spread of people and people's opinions, particularly those that you can see very close to the Ugandan border. So from this map, you can see that for a lot of people, particularly in the Dinka Nuer areas in the central north of the country, Kenya is far away. It's a long journey, and it's a difficult journey. So before I talk about the research itself, I'll talk a bit about the journeys that people face, and also how long it takes, because that's very useful then for developing predictions that even if conflict happened in 2016 in your home area, you might not reach Kenya until 2017. It just takes that long and is that difficult. So 2 days to 1 year were the length of time people told me it took them from leaving their home to reaching to reaching Kenya, and that's only for people who had the express intention when they left that they wanted to leave the country. There are many people who, say in 2013 at the outbreak of conflict, immediately went to a protection of civilians site and stayed there for 3-4 years until they left then for Kenya. The main method that people use at the start is footing, is going on foot. And this will often take 2 months, 3 months. It depends a lot on whether you're traveling with children or not. And so this journey is most difficult for women traveling alone with their children. One woman I spoke to traveling with her 4 children couldn't travel with them all at the same time. And so she had to leave 2 in as safe a place as she could find, travel to the next safe place with 2 of them, then leave them there, go back, collect the other 2 children and return. She eventually made it with all 4 of her children, but it was a very difficult and long journey for her. If you're walking for 2 or 3 months, there's no way you can transport enough food or water for yourself, especially if you're carrying children at the same time. So one woman I spoke to, she lost her husband and 2 children in an attack on the village. And then as she was traveling with her remaining 2 children, they both died of thirst on the road. And so she arrived in Juba on her own and found 4 orphans, looked after them and brought them to Kakuma with her. So these journeys themselves are really, really difficult for people. And often they have to rely on the kindness of strangers. You arrive in a village, if people have a bit of food spare, they will share it with you, but as the war's been progressing, people just have less and less and less. One woman, she told me that her and another group of people she met on the road, they found some sorghum that had been thrown away by someone. They picked out the edible bits and then they carried it with them and they'd eat, and then they'd walk again for 2 days until they felt like they were about to die, and then they would eat again and carry on walking, and that's how they made it all the way to, I think, Juba as well. Then you've got the dangers of, if you're a Nuer walking through Dinka areas, if you're found, you'll likely be killed. It's the same for Dinka walking through Nuer areas. So you have to then travel at night. That brings with it dangers of not seeing snakes, scorpions, spiders. And I'll read a quote from one man I spoke to. We ran through the bush. Some of our group were eaten by lions. Then we reached a river. We had to cross it, but not all of us made it across. The crocodiles were there. We reached another river. The same problem. Each time we were less. And so these journeys themselves are very difficult. And even once that journey's finished, most people will have only reached Juba or another major transport hub, and from there, the ideal scenario is you take a bus or a lorry or some method of transport to the Kenyan border. One woman I spoke to spent $500 for her US dollars for her and her 5 children to take a bus to the border. So it's a or can be a very expensive trip. And it seems to me that the majority of people I spoke to were eventually helped by Good Samaritans, but there are also a lot of people who are profiting from these problems. But fortunately, I think more people are more civilians are helping each other than trying to profit. That $500 is not affordable to most people. Other people I spoke to, it's closer to $50, but even that, if you've left your home with nothing, is far too much to be able to afford. And so some people were stuck for a month in Juba, some people for up to 7 months trying to earn the money. And there were 4 different ways of earning this money that I came across. And I'll just read you 4 quotes that I think sum them all up. It was expensive. We had no money, so we gave our possessions. For 1 year, I was looking for money to travel. My wife had to sleep with the general to get passage. We were helped by a businessman in the road driving to the Kenyan border to Nairobi. He found me crying by the side of the road and stopped to help. So there are good Samaritans, there are people who have property and can sell it, there are people who are forced into prostituting themselves, and then there are people who are just stuck in Juba until they manage to beg enough money or to earn enough money to be able to get passage. So before I start presenting my results, I hope you'll forgive me for trying to make some use of the expertise in this room. And when I've been speaking to people, I've been very interested in what their perceptions are of the causes for South Sudanese leaving South Sudan, and what keeps people in South Sudan, and why come to Kenya. So what I've done is I've prepared a few sheets. I'd like you just to get into groups of 3 or 4 and to write out your list of the factors you think are most important. So I've divided it into 3 different columns. We've got the push factors, so what pushes people to leave. We've got the stickiness, I don't know if you can come up with a better term for that, which is what keeps you in South Sudan. So it may be, for example, being stuck and not knowing where to go, or it may be other factors that keep you there that mean you don't want to leave. And then why Kenya? And also, if you think something is missing from this, please tell me. Especially when you're in the middle of speaking to people, you get very focused on the reasons that you're told by the people you're speaking to, and it's sometimes difficult to start thinking, okay, well, what am I not asking about that would also be very interesting to speak to them about? So those will be very helpful to think about all the possible reasons that I've perhaps missed. So, yeah, I just wanted to apologize as well. I didn't tell you, I'm based in the Department of Geography, but I'm trained undergraduate in psychology and then in political science. And now one of my supervisors is a political scientist, the other's a geographer. And I realized that actually I made this map and I didn't put a key for the different lines, so I am very sorry. And I'm sure the geographers in my department would be annoyed with me. So the first thing that I really tried to focus in on was disaggregating violence. And so the question I was asking myself is how, or you can read it, but it's how do these different types of violence affect people's decisions in different ways? And so the main, or I suppose I'll read a quote that sort of sums up the impact of a generalized civil war. Community clashes affect community through fighting. People lose life, keep running and cannot cultivate. Rebel fighting against the government affected international trade and international development from coming to South Sudan. So what this man was saying was that the general civil war was affecting basic services, was affecting investment in the country or the state's ability to look after its citizens. And what really affected him then personally in terms of violence was these community clashes that were occurring more often. And so this was a similar story I heard from many people, that the overall civil war, if it's just soldiers fighting against each other, is not so much of a problem in terms of having to leave your home. Of course it's a big problem, but it's the knock-on effects it has on things like education, healthcare, food, and then also when armed forces are not behaving, or they're just being terrible and attacking civilians, that's when it directly impacts people. Then when there's the insecurity, the robberies. And so the main problem that I heard from people was of government forces attacking civilians. Beyond that, there are also rebel attacks on civilians, not as often in the people I spoke to, but definitely common enough to be a major problem as well.
Why were the security forces or police, why were they treating them like that?
I have my suspicions, but I don't know for certain. It seems to me like the government, so the government of South Sudan is broadly aligned with the Dinka, although there are factions within that are very much against the government, and the opposition is broadly aligned with the Nuer. And it seems to me that the government are actively trying to destroy the Nuer in South Sudan. And so I don't know enough about exactly what's happening, so I'd hesitate to say it, but it seems to be approaching a deliberate genocide in many ways.
It's not that two neighboring communities have a clash. It's more that the state's mechanism is used for.
Yes, so that's the major problem. There are still the two communities having clashes, and it's happening more often than it normally would, because it's always happened in South Sudan that there's fighting over cattle, there are just general community clashes, but they're now happening more because of the general insecurity in the country, and so there's less of a rule of law to prevent them from happening, and there's just so much more weaponry available to people. So, thank you. What I'll do now is I'm presenting some sort of broad results on the key themes I was interested in, and then I'll break down the reasons I found for Dinka leaving South Sudan, for Nuer leaving South Sudan, and then for the Equatorian tribes, because I found there were marked differences based on which ethnic group you were affiliated or you are from. So going on from violence to food insecurity, which was the other major thing I was interested in. Actually, very few people cited food insecurity as the major reason for leaving. I think it was only 2 or 3 out of the 87 that I spoke to. So it's a very small number. But almost everyone said that they were food insecure and that their food situation was very bad. And so to illustrate this, I asked a lot of people, how's your food situation now in Kakuma? And they would say to me, it's very bad, because it is. We can only eat 1 meal a day. If I eat today at lunchtime, then tomorrow I can't eat till the evening. I can't feed my children till the evening. But that food situation was, they said, better than the food situation they would have right now in a lot of areas of South Sudan just because of the conflict. So it's potentially a reason, but in people's minds at least it's not the most important reason for them leaving. Many people linked food insecurity, they saw it as an economic reason for leaving rather than a food reason. So if you own lots of cattle, that makes you essentially food secure, and if your cattle are stolen, then you've got nothing left. But in their minds, rather than being food insecure, you're poor. You've got no money, you've got no property, no possessions. So that's perhaps a cultural way of thinking about things that's slightly different to the way I thought about it. And finally, perhaps it's also the UNHCR assessments are misleading, because in all of the reports they're saying food insecurity or what people are leaving, food insecurity. Now I suspect that's partly due to the malnutrition rates of people arriving, but these malnutrition rates, or at least my opinion of it, are more likely to have occurred en route. So if you're walking 2 or 3 months, like I said, with no food, you are going to be in a very bad state when you arrive. And so definitely the food insecurity was a problem, but at the point when they left, it wasn't such a big problem as it appears to be when they arrive at the destination. And so that might be why the UNHCR are playing such an important role on food insecurity. So then it was on to sources of information. So I'm interested in, well, what do people know about Kenya? What do people know about the options available to them? How do you get this information? Do you trust it? So generally it was word of mouth was the main source of information. Somebody knew somebody who had either been to Kakuma, who was in Kakuma and spoken to them, had read about it, heard about it from NGO staff, this, that and the other. And so a lot of people would just bump into each other on the road. One person in a group of 15, 20, however many people would know about Kakuma, and so then they'd all go there because, well, it's an option, it's something to go towards. Mobile phones were quite important in relaying information, and particularly from people who were in Kakuma, persuading their relatives or their friends to leave South Sudan and come to Kakuma. Lots of people said, oh yes, I was persuaded to leave. One young man was about to join up the fighting as a rebel, and then one of his family members said, "I'll come to Kakuma, you can get your education, you can do those things here, you don't have to become a soldier." Then there was also personal experience, because Kakuma has been open for so long, since '92. There are lots of people who were previously in Kakuma and decided to return. And finally, how people used this information. I generally found that very few people knew of an opportunity other than Kenya to go to, and there was not much information available to most people. This was not so much the case with the Equatorians, as you'd expect, because they were close to Uganda. They knew a lot more about Uganda. And so for the Equatorians in particular, it would be coming to Kenya because it's further away from their problems. But then what I also heard from a lot of people across South Sudan who had heard of Uganda, they were put off Uganda because apparently it was more expensive to get to than Kenya. And they were under the impression that once you reach the border, you have to pay for your transport to the settlement within Uganda, rather than in Kenya where the UNHCR collects you. Now, I wasn't aware of that. I don't know if it's true, whether it's misinformation or what's happening, but I'm looking forward to going to Uganda and finding out what the situation is there, to then perhaps it's even deliberate misinformation by people who don't want as many people coming to Uganda. I don't know. So a lot of people also then said, who had the opportunities between the two, Kenya was more appealing because of the education system and because of the history of Kakuma, and also just because they know that peace is in Kenya. Ooh, wrong one, sorry. So now we'll go on to the different ethnic groups and the reasons for leaving. So I interviewed 35 Dinka, and if you tot up all the numbers, they'll add up to more than 35, because some people quoted 2 or 3 reasons as the major reasons for leaving, so they've been counted more than once. As you can see, for the Dinka, it was violence as well. For me, it was a learning curve. I was particularly, I think, almost too sensitive about asking people about the violence, and so I didn't ask people to specify what sort of violence was the problem. I realized after the first, I think, 15 interviews that people were willing to speak a lot more openly about it, and so I could begin to disaggregate, well, what sort of violence was it that affected you? And people were generally happy to speak about these things. So unfortunately for this model, generalized violence for 11 people, it could be government versus rebel attacks, it could be community clashes, it could be rebel attacks on civilians, government attacks on civilians, I'm not sure. But what really surprised me for the Dinka was the number of people who had personal problems, specifically family problems were the main reason for leaving. In the Dinka cultural practices are, if your husband dies, then it's your brother-in-law's duty to look after you and your children. Now, generally, I think that works well, because generally people are nice and will behave well to each other. You'll look after your nephews and nieces. But there are also a lot of instances where people just are not nice. And so lots of problems with brothers-in-law just coming and wanting the property, wanting the children, because especially daughters are a source of wealth because of the dowry you obtain from selling them off for marriage. Then lots of problems of forced marriage, women being forced to marry people they did not want to, and so leaving because of that. Then problems with the father-in-law husband. What I'm going to do is I'll read, I think, some quotes from people will better illustrate some of these reasonings for the push factors, the stickiness, and why Kenya, and you can look around that as you see fit and ask any questions. So these are all from people I spoke to, men and women, all Dinka in Kakuma. The government rebel war is very far from me and is not affecting me. Community clashes affected me through loss of life of youth and not having the freedom to go around as normal. I left because some of the problems between myself and my husband's family. My husband died of sickness and left me with 5 children. Brother-in-law came and took 3 children to marry them off. And so lots of people who have arrived in Kakuma have not arrived with all of their children because they've not been able to find them and take them all. I lost my husband in 2015. As soon as the bad news came, my brother-in-law came the next morning and demanded property and daughter, who was 13 years old, for marriage off to someone. He beat my first daughter and broke her bones. He also beat me. My small girl escaped her husband's house. Then the brother-in-law came for my second daughter, as he had already taken the cattle from the dowry and didn't want to have to give it back, so she fled with her children. I left South Sudan for many reasons. Education is the key to succeed, and if not available, you go outside your country. War and attacks as well. My mother was killed in 2009. I took my younger brother to Juba. We were living in Juba for 4 years until 2013. Decided to leave Juba after the war restarted and realized there was little chance for education. And so I think in 2013 he'd only been 14, so he'd left on his own to Juba as a 10-year-old with his little brother. And the final one, which is more for why Kenya, I think, is met other people in the bush. We saw no one attacked each other, so we ran together. I'd never heard of Kakuma before I met the group. So I think that's all for the... So those are some of the quotes from the Dinka that I heard about. Generally what people said kept them there was that they had, or that they thought other people were staying in Kenya, in South Sudan even, was having family support from people in government or people working for NGOs who could then protect you. They could send the children to school and continue functioning, but then also a lot of people had nowhere to go or no money to go there, which was constant across all ethnic groups. So moving on to the Nuer, and these stories are very distressing, and they were very distressing to me. So if you would like me to stop reading these quotes, just put up a hand there and I will not read out the full quotes. As you can see, the vast majority of Nuer that I spoke to were fleeing violence, and that was 17 of the 23 was government attacks on civilians. I left because the country is at war. There is no food, no education, insecurity everywhere. Women are being raped. The war has no stop. I just want my children to start school. Actually, there is a lot of war in South Sudan, but that one of government attacking civilians is very bad. The others happen, but not so bad. So now the next one's a lot of the people who told me these things want these things to be known, so that's why I'm sharing them. So here we can see for the Equatorian tribes, it's similar reasons as for the Nuer, lots of government attacks on civilians, but also now more rebel attacks on civilians. A lot of the Equatorians, because they lived near mountains, could hide in the bush, and it was easier for them to then stay in South Sudan. But generally I found the Equatorian reasons were more similar to the Nuer, and it was the Dinka who seemed to be more similar to the relative utility model. So they weighed up the options in South Sudan against the options in Kenya and decided to come to Kenya. Whereas for a lot of the Nuer and the Equatorians, it's just when shit hit the fan, we've got to leave. The interesting thing, particularly if you remember the Equatorians were all close to the Uganda border. For Equatorians who left, it was mainly, or choosing Uganda was because of the personal problems or problems with particular rebel or government groups. And there's a lot of government and rebel activity within Kakuma as well, but a lot in Uganda too. And so they thought that going to Uganda, they would still not be safe because people would find them. And so Kenya's further away, they're safer. And then particularly if you've got problems within your own community, family problems similar to what I spoke about with the Dinka, they can also feel safer in Kakuma, even though actually Kakuma just isn't safe for a lot of people. People still are having a terrible time there. So, like I said at the start, please be critical. Please, that way I'll learn something and it will be useful and it will help the project to be actually useful. So, is there anything you think that's missing? Then specifically talking about factors like education as a main reason for leaving South Sudan. If these things are written about, there are some people around the world who would latch on to that and say, oh, well, that's the reason all refugees are leaving. They're just leaving because they want education. They're not having a bad time back home. Could that be dangerous for the refugee situation? I don't know. I'd appreciate any advice on that. And then also, people didn't really speak much about the economic or environmental factors. And so if you've got any ideas of how they would relate to displacement, then please do say them. And any questions you have, please fire away.
My name is Chair, and my second name is Deng. I'm a student in Kenyatta University in Kenya here, and I happen also to be a refugee by status. I came to Kenya in 2005, and I was young, and it is good that if I find such a program, I would also speak, because I feel that I belong there too. I saw many factors that you mentioned, and I was surprised that there are some more factors that you considered, but basically it is because of the conflict. Now, if people talk about economic problems and conflict, from where I come from, it is two in one. Because traditionally, especially from my background, you only have something to eat when you keep your cattle, you go to the farm. But when there is conflict, you keep running, hiding yourself, then you will likely leave behind your cattle, you will likely leave behind your farm to go and dig. So you realize that by that consequence, you will have nothing to eat, because you cannot carry all your cows, your goats with you, because you'll have to carry children, for example, and go hiding. You cannot hide with animals. So by that factor, you'll have problems of what to eat. Secondly, because there was school. Sudan as a country at first had a school. But you see, when there is conflict, people are fighting, assuming this is a battleground, you'll realize that even the buildings will be burned down. So by the time of coming back, you'll realize that some of your teachers have become the soldiers themselves. There is no building to learn, and that is why the education become a factor thereafter. But the major factor in this case is when there is a challenge with the war. Sometimes the internal conflict between the communities usually arise because maybe you are seen to be somehow, maybe like the way he said, that the Dinkas themselves, according to his projection, many of them, this is Dinka. If you realize, you'll see violence is 14 as compared to the total number, which is 35. Now, I want to say something, the difference between Dinka and Nuer and an Equatorian. You see, many wars that have taken place, especially after we got independent from 2013, have always been at the base of the rebels group. So if your background is where there is offensive, there is war, there is an attack, constant attack, then you will realize that that base will basically be displaced, a lot of destruction will take place. Because at no time would you say that the war is equally distributed in the country. You will realize that there is a base where is seen to be much of the base of the government group that the rebels do not access to, and the government is pushing to the side of the rebels, so that destruction will take place. Take, for example, of the Equatorian. If you go to the Equatorian, Equatoria is around the capital of Sudan, South Sudan, around Juba. That is where the capital is. And if you may have heard in the news or have read, the war that took place in 2016, that the capital was in Juba. So you realize, including 2013, it started in Juba. So when you have the center of war, and people are pushing from the center of the war, that it affects the surrounding. For example, in 2013, it started in Juba and moved around Juba. So it is likely that the people around that area will be displaced more than those that are not around. So that is in 2013, including also 2016. So anybody that may have left Equatoria during that period, it's because you cannot decide to sit in your house and wait as fighting is taking place, because you might be shot accidentally, though not intended. So those are the specific differences. But just to say that education is the main challenge would not be good, because if it was the education challenges, then it can also be addressed back at home. So the main challenge is war that pushes people away to go to another country. So that is, I wanted to bring those connections to why there is always economic problems, especially where people are fighting. Because if you look also for Dinka, please take it there, I think, if you also look for Dinka, you realize that even the number of people that say for food, not all Dinka, by the way, because I'm a Dinka and I'm a refugee, I also think these people who are here, including him, are also Dinka. So it depends with where you are located among Dinkas. If you are at the base of where the government comes from, then you are likely to use your farm, keep your cattle, keep your goats, and everything that you could use. You can also take your natural plant products and eat them, especially when you are at that base. So you realize that not all Dinkas go because of food problems. Sometimes they may have, especially if you are in a place where there is constant war, so that you don't do anything, then you'll have to go through the same challenges. So that is the difference I want to put across. Okay. But not that, and again, to answer what you said earlier, you said that there was targeting on certain communities. That would be wrong, because I am a Dinka. I cannot say I was targeted. Sometime it comes, I think I walked out when you mentioned, sometime you may be seen to be targeted, not because government is targeting you. It's either you will be seen as somebody who is being recruited to fight against the government. Even if you are a Dinka and you are seen to be recruited to fight against the government, then you will be seen as an enemy of the government. So they will hand you down, basically. Also another challenge is that you realize that the wars that have always been taking place, people are not in a specific war uniform. So any group of gathering that is seen and be working against the government would always want to bring them down. And yes, there are also historical problems between the two communities, Nuer and Dinka. So like they always mention of 91, you've heard of it, I think. So those have always made the bad elements in the government probably to hand down specific people of a certain community, just believing that because at one time we fought, they may also likely revenge this time. So because also there is that historical problems that have not been addressed because of lack of goodwill from the political elite. So those are the things that I wanted to add. Thank you.
Thank you. So with the education, I agree that it's for most people part of the reason, but there were still some people who specifically said they left South Sudan because they wanted an education. Now, of course, they can't get the education because the conflict is happening. So ultimately, the root cause is conflict, but it manifests itself in different... Sorry, Malek, there's one question just behind you first, and then...
Okay, thank you very much. I think my question, my name is Richard, and I am curious about one reason for people coming to Kenya, particularly the Equatorial tribes. You had mentioned that there would be an open route to attract them to Kenya. Yet we always hear stories of roadblocks, especially during the violence. So how do they relate? Thank you.
So an open route is not an open route. It's still a difficult route. But to them, it's an easier route than the alternative of heading south through areas that are experiencing conflict in Uganda. I've got a map somewhere of the roads in South Sudan as well, and so an open route also in the case for some people means, well, where can you get vehicle transport rather than having to walk through a war zone? They do face roadblocks. I think that's part of the reason why it's so expensive to travel.
Thank you. My name is Malek. I'm a student at the University of Nairobi, undergraduate student. I'm a refugee by status, but I'm urban refugee in town. Thank you very much, Mr. Nando, for the presentation. I would want you to go back. There is something I saw it's not right for presentation of the day. I think in the beginning about the model, something. Yes, here I have seen environmental factor. There is something I would like to maybe dispute, but there may be also a reason behind it. You realize in South Sudan, there are 2 seasons or 3, if I'm not wrong. There are dry seasons and rainy season, of which I believe areas almost bordering Kakuma also there is a drought. So if somebody says South Sudanese are also living because of environmental factor, specifically drought, I would not agree, because even Kakuma itself, there is a lack of rainfall. There's also lack of rainfall in most of the areas in South Sudan. So I don't think it's one of the factors that led to the displacement of or force to come to Kenya or Uganda. That's one of the things I would also like to say. Second, on a political factor, it depends on who is saying it, because targeting specific ethnicity, I would say it depends with who is saying it, because if you look at where you come from, you would always want to defend where you come from, and that may cover the truth at some point. But I think in some cases it may be true, as I said earlier, our politicians in South Sudan, when they are recruiting soldiers, they recruit them as a civilian. And instead of training them, they take them as soldiers, and then when the government kills them, those are people we consider as civilian. So because if you put a uniform on a man who is not militarily trained like you, I would still call you a civilian. So that would also depend on who is saying it. But I may not disagree with it fully. Because if you look at our politicians, there are statements they always release that incite the citizen of South Sudan, of which I know there has never been any problem between South Sudanese themselves, the civilian themselves. Because where I come from, I border Nuer, Amadinka, and my brother here is a Nuer. We border, we have that borders there. But we have been staying together. Some of Dinkas are even initiated the same way. Nuer are initiated with the same language. They speak at daytime. You find them speaking different language. So to me, I have never believed that South Sudan, there is a problem between 2 tribes. It is only political statement. That is how I can put it, political statement. I think, thank you very much.
Okay. I agree that it's very dangerous to make the South Sudanese problem a problem of 2 different tribes, and it definitely isn't. But unfortunately, part of the reality of what's happening is that the Nuer in particular are being really heavily targeted by sometimes government forces. I've heard also that there are forces from other African nations that are involved in this. And what will happen is, even if there are rebels present in the area, the government will defeat the rebels will run away, but the government will stay in that area. And I've got a sheet of quotes. If anyone would like to read about what's happening, I can pass it around at the end. In terms of the environmental factors, that's something I actually found really interesting. So for the Equatorians, when I put this to an Equatorian, he said, "What, drought? We have water all the time. We'll never have drought. What are you talking about?" Yeah. Whereas in the north of South Sudan, it does become more arid or semi-arid, and so drought can become a factor. But like you said, people have not specifically stated that drought was a problem for them leaving. You're right, Kakuma has a lack of rainfall, but for that we assume that people know Kakuma has a lack of rainfall before leaving. So we have to make some assumptions to think whether that would be a factor in people choosing Kakuma. Yeah, and any other questions? Yes, please.
Okay, maybe not a question, but good evening. My name is Irene. About the push factors, I think I would just want to interest us to think about them. Dinkas. I come from Uganda personally. Most of them are kind of rich. So when this war is like this, maybe the push factor, one of it could be to come and do business. They come to our markets, buy all the goats. Actually, they offer the biggest amount of money than what the locals could provide. And then take back, because somehow they have that road license, I don't know very well, but they can navigate the roads fairly well than I don't want to think than other tribes, but most of them are in Uganda to do business, cattle, goats, pigs, whatever, but they take the best because they can offer the best. We would also think about it somehow on the push factors. Thank you.
And when you say most of them, are you referring to Dinka or South Sudanese?
Most of them.
Okay, so I think I'll find out more when I speak to them there. I did hear that for many choosing Uganda over Kenya, this was the opinion, especially of Equatorians I spoke to in Kenya who had more knowledge, or up in Kakuma, who had more knowledge of Uganda. People with money are more likely to choose Uganda because Uganda offers opportunities for work, which Kenya doesn't. And so if you've got some money, then you go to Uganda because you can do business. And in general, what I've read about this is that it's been very positive for Uganda. I think on average every refugee there has created 1 to 2 jobs for Ugandans themselves. I'm sure there are instances as well where people are not behaving properly and perhaps coming and buying up all the best livestock, as you say, and that is a problem. But I'm not sure it's the majority of people, or I'd be surprised.
Hi, thank you first of all for the presentation. It was very interesting. I wanted to ask, well, first of all, I just wanted to say that whenever we talked about factors for people becoming refugees, it's always very political. And I think we should always be aware of that, of what the way we portray our data and what message it sends out. Also, I don't know, for example, I just saw research of someone who was talking about the cultural value of mobility, of how important it is as something that you go through in life as a rite of passage, and how this is the reason for many people leaving to Europe, right? And we had this like very heated debate about whether this is something he should publish or not, of what consequences it might have for people from Africa wanting to come. Yeah. So I think we should always have that in mind. And I was wondering how gendered the reasons the violence was, or other reasons for leaving. You talked a lot about children. So I was wondering how that affected, if you could elaborate on that. And also I think another thing that maybe is a very important factor is they imagine the future they could have when they leave. So maybe options for higher education, but also for resettlement or for other things. What rumors they hear, it doesn't have to be the real option, but what options they have. So maybe, we were discussing here that maybe the options in Kakuma, or what they hear, that they have more options for resettlement than the policies in Uganda about being resettled permanently into certain residency, or,
So starting with the resettlement, I don't think many people at all are being resettled in. You meant in their perceptions of it. Exactly. So it seems that the South Sudanese think it's all the Somalis who are being resettled. The Somalis think it's only the South Sudanese who are being resettled. So I don't know if there would be much of a pull factor from the information that you get from people you know in Kakuma that, you'll be resettled, because the different refugees from different nations think that everyone else is getting resettled simply because no one is. And then also there's not much knowledge about Kakuma itself. When I asked people, so what did you know about Kenya? They said, we just heard it was safe, or I heard my children could get an education there, or we know there's food there, but mainly we know it's safe, if they knew anything at all. in terms of the gendered reasons for leaving, I think in my sample of 87, it was around a 50-50 split between women and men. Most of the women I spoke to, the reasons were civilian attacks or family problems. So with the Dinka, it was problems with the brothers-in-law, fathers-in-law, and then in general it was attacks on civilians for the other groups. For men, it was a lot more to do with either they had family that they had to protect, or there were no opportunities in South Sudan. So there was the violence, but then there was also the opportunity for continued education by coming to Kenya. And so that played more of a role. And then also for many men actually who did not want to be involved in the conflict. And so some people I spoke to, he was being courted by both the rebels and the government to join them, and he didn't want to be involved. And the longer he pushed it or pushed it away, he would suddenly become a target for both sides, and so he had to leave. And there were a few situations like that, especially of the men who were involved in the violence. Okay, I think you had a question first. Or you? Yeah.
So I was wondering, we know that both Kenya and Uganda accept refugees and give asylum on a prima facie basis. And I was wondering whether you think that your research suggests that a significant number of refugees should not be considered as convention refugees, meaning they're not specifically persecuted or not specifically affiliated with persecuted groups. And if so, do you believe this should or can affect the refugee status determination policies in Kenya or Uganda?
That's something that me personally, I think pretty much every reason I heard is enough to warrant refugee protection. But unfortunately, under the current laws, a lot of the things, I wouldn't say they specifically don't fit in, because they are still virtually everyone having problems with violence and insecurity, and their lives are in threat. It's just that many people are willing to live with that threat because they have pride in their country in South Sudan and think that they can continue to survive. And so the tipping factor itself may be something that's not traditionally associated with a formal refugee status, but that thing, again, like people have been saying, only comes about because of the violence. So it's still caused by the civil war, by the insecurity. And I wouldn't want to delve into that, really. But that's something that I am going to have to deal with at some point. So any advice on how to phrase these things would be much appreciated. Does that answer?
Thank you. I just wanted to make just half a comment, half a question, and then a question. The first one was, I wonder whether the fact that people didn't stress food insecurity is really just partly a reflection of the fact that life was always hard. That having difficulties of food was sort of part of life, and connected to environmental factors. And maybe it was something that makes things different, and that was violent. That maybe the thing they perceive as pushing them. I wondered whether you could even get at environmental factors less from talking to individuals, but whether there is actually a correlation between particular periods of drought and larger numbers of people actually moving. And then my other question was, from the stories you've been telling, it sounds very much as though maybe people join up with others on the way, but very often they're leaving home in very small numbers. Do they leave sort of as individuals or just a person in a family? And I'm just thinking about the enormous courage it must take for a woman by herself, with kids. I'm not sure I would do it. And it's just trying to picture the situation that would actually push somebody to do that completely into the unknown. I mean, even much beyond the village, maybe all they've ever known.
Yeah. So for those reasons, I can hand you the sheet of things that are happening, and with that happening, it's a very easy decision to leave. In terms of how many people leave at a time, it seems to be people scatter in different directions. So often people are separated from their families themselves, and you run because you have to, and you don't know what's happened to your father, you don't know what's happened to your sister, to your children, and many people have ended up here completely separated, no idea whether the family members are still alive or not, or where they are. So in those instances, you don't have time to leave as a community. And then sometimes you'll meet, so one woman met her sister's children in the bush and looked after them and brought them with her. Then with regards to the food insecurity, I think for many people there has always been that sort of, those problems of scarcity and abundance. But everyone I spoke to, if the conflict wasn't happening, spoke about their food situation as wonderful. If you work hard, you can have food. There's no problems. If you work hard on the land, then you will be fine. Maybe that's also partly a rose-tinted vision of what life used to be like, but generally I think it was accurate. So I'm not sure exactly what is going on with the food insecurity. And like you say, I've got data on 114,000 South Sudanese refugees in Kenya from the UNHCR and where they came from in South Sudan and the day they arrived. And so I will be modelling drought and rainfall during key crop growing seasons to see whether there is any correlation.
How much of the conflict arose because of the discovery of oil? Is there anything to do with that?
So a lot of people I spoke to who fled in 2012 who are living sort of up in the north area close to the border with Sudan. That was conflict between the South Sudanese government and the Khartoum government over oil, and they left specifically because of those clashes. But nobody that I spoke to who had left after that cited oil as a problem or a reason for the conflict happening in their area. It may well be a major reason for the conflict as a whole continuing. For example, I think in 2014 at some point, both sides pretty much ran out of ammunition, and so the war stopped for a couple of weeks because nobody could fire anything, and then suddenly both sides were fully stocked with ammunition again. And so you wonder, well, how do the sides get that money? This is pure speculation. I've got no evidence whatsoever to back it up, but it could well be through the oil. And so in that respect, I'd have thought the presence of oil then does have an effect on the conflict.
Thank you. Thank you for your presentation. So I'm also working on refugee camps, but with Congolese community, and I'm an anthropologist. I've been in Kakuma, but also in other camps in the region, so in Uganda and in Burundi. And there is something interesting you said in your presentation. It was about some people living far away from Kenya, saying that they were coming into Kenya because it was so far that it could be safe. Mm. And with the Congolese people I'm working with, I also had the same feelings that when I was in Burundi, people were less insecure in Congo than the Congolese in Kakuma. And the Congolese in Kakuma, it was sure that they had to leave because of huge security reasons. And the other ones in Burundi, they were going and they were still going in Congo, going back in the camp, and they were still more involved in the social interaction of what happened in Congo. So I think it's interesting to see like how the distance changed also, like because in all this refugees community there are a lot of different factors, but also you haven't said it, but you can also find war criminals in the camp. So there is not only like people facing your danger in the country. So yeah, it was just a comment.
Thank you. I mean, yeah, in Kakuma there is apparently a big It's almost a big source of employment for Kenyans and South Sudanese in catching rebels and taking them back to South Sudan to the government, which apparently happens a lot, which is slightly related to war criminal, I guess. But they're not necessarily war criminals, they're not necessarily even involved that heavily. Anyone else got a question, want to add anything? Yes, please.
Okay, I'm Alex, I'm a student, anthropologist. In your last slide you talked about the people being pulled to Kenya because Uganda, choosing between Kenya and Uganda. You said that they're being pulled to Kenya because Uganda was more closer to their problems. I think that was more psychological, yeah? So you didn't talk about more about the psychological pull and push factors, or why refugees can come here. Thank you.
So for many it was actually very physical, and they were in Uganda before and had problems, were caught, were on their way to be killed, but managed to escape and came to Kakuma because it was the only other place they could think of that was perhaps further away. I'm sure as well for many it is psychological, and I didn't ask that much about it. That's something that when I'm in Uganda I will be interested to ask people about, and what they feel when they think about the two options. The main problem I had in Kakuma was that most people didn't really know anything about Uganda, so I couldn't compare their feelings for the two, and a lot of the Equatorians I spoke to wanted to end the interview early just because it was so difficult speaking about their problems, and so I couldn't press them on a lot of issues I'd have liked to ask about. Yes.
Yes, okay, my name is Angelo Ring. You talk about sickness, no money to go, and can hide in the bush. There's also one factor you didn't mention. When you're in Kakuma, you found out that most of the people in Kakuma are young men and young women, and there are no old people above 60s or 70s. And you mentioned before that most of the young men are the target when it comes to conflict. They're being forcefully recruited by the government or by the rebels. So what they do, their fathers or their uncles will always say, go because we are old, we cannot be recruited by force, we'll remain behind. That's one of the reasons they remain behind, they don't leave. I think you didn't mention that. Thank you.
So that's very interesting, thank you. And someone did tell me that their grandmother and their father told them, look, we are old, we are too weak to travel, you leave. But that's good, thank you.
Just another slightly different question. Partly prompted by the fact that a moment or two ago you said that you're talking to some of the Equatorians found it difficult to continue with the interview, and that earlier you had said that you got more Dinka than you had expected because people were basically lining up to talk to you. And so I was wondering how you'd got your informants and whether there's some possibility that, if people are lining up to talk to you, you're going to get a slightly skewed impression.
Yes. So with the Equatorians as well, people were lining up to speak to me, but I simply couldn't speak to them all because my translator couldn't work the whole day. And so that was the reason why there weren't as many. And I don't know, maybe it's just cultural differences between the Dinka Nuer and then the Equatorians that they did not speak so long. I'm not sure what exactly it is.
But you're going to find a very different response from if you've got people who are volunteering as opposed to ones you're choosing.
Yes. So everyone who spoke was a volunteer. It was just, so I had two main translators, one Dinka and one Nuer who also spoke Juba Arabic. and they would go into communities and speak to people, and then it was anybody who wanted to come and speak to me, because I can't force people to tell me their stories. So you're right, I will get different information from the people who actually want to speak about it, but I couldn't see a way around that. Okay, well, thank you very much for taking the time to come and listen to me and for giving me constructive feedback. I'm going to stick around for a while if anyone wants to ask more questions in private. If anyone wants to read some of the quotes, I can hand you the sheet. Thank you.